Today, I want to talk about the time I got called into the general manager's office regarding some discussions that I had had. So I was working at DRS on the OBPV program at the time, and we were working with one of the other DRS business units who did complementary work on converters. And I went to their GM to ask about could we work on some concepts that I had regarding improving the overall system between the two companies. Essentially, what I was doing was, would he be willing to support the team with our team at my business unit and share some work? And, my goal was to find out, was there any room for him to do that, or was he only interested in, kind of following the trail he'd been doing for years? So, was it a dry hole, or was there something worth pursuing? But, a few days later, I was called into the office at my office. And my general manager basically said, never do that. Don't ever go talk to the management at another firm. That's something that absolutely has to go through channels. At the time, I was very confused. I mean, I had no intent of starting anything, of trying to fund anything or anything like that. I just wanted to make sure it was worthwhile for us to even have the discussion. So I was confused, and it's taken me 20 years to really understand what was going on. So if you're an engineer or anybody in the technical world, you've probably seen this in person. So, many people operate far beyond the title, the role that they officially have. And, there are many times when people will go and they'll talk to the wrong people or connect the wrong dots, and then they'll get told to stay in the lane. This isn't a personality problem. I mean, it's really a structural problem. And this is a problem that has a name and it has a cost. And what I want to do here is to give you a tool that you can diagnose yourself and diagnose your organization so you can get a better feel for where you are and maybe things that you can do. So there's a framework for this. It's been structured over some time. Back in the 1990s, there was the concept of the T-type person, where you're deep in a very technical area, but you have essentially a lot of ability to coordinate with other people. And the basic idea is that you would have people who were good at their job and would work with others, and that was all you needed. Essentially, an organization was made up of these T-type experts, and then there was coordination between those to create products. And then in the more recent past, it was basically seen that there were pi-type persons, that is, somebody who has a technical expertise, or maybe two technical expertise, or a technical expertise in some systems or project management, and they were great at coordinations. And these people were called boundary spanners, and they were very much people who carried context from one part of a project to another and said, okay, you haven't thought about this, or you've not gone here. And, that was basically people, kind of a little bit like me earlier in my career, working forward. And in more recent time, there's a Cambridge and Chalmers concept called the tri-type engineer. MIT is working on this with some of their people, with their undergraduates. And the idea is you have three pillars. One is that you have, a deep technical expertise in one area. Another is that you have significant expertise in digital and computational areas so that you know how all of that works and ties. And then you'll have another expertise maybe in projects or programs or another deep technical area. And reality is I operated in that mode for years as somebody who was very deep into packaging, very deep into manufacturing, and very deep into programmatics and kind of cross-organizational. Essentially, the issue is that people who are boundary crossers, the pies and the tries, are often seen as problem makers, and the organizations often don't use these people well. And the problem with that, where you focus on your T-type expertise, is there's a coordination tax. It's invisible, it doesn't turn up, but it's very real, and it compounds because again and again you will miss problems or miss things that maybe a boundary crosser would have seen, but your narrow niche experts don't get because they haven't got the breadth to go and look beyond. So the numbers on this are pretty significant. Oh, there's a 10% impact on your budget just because of the not getting your coordination done. There's basically a 20% of your work week is often spent in coordination tasks where you are synthesizing something to hand off to somebody else or trying to figure out what somebody else told you and make sense of it because that's not in your area. And then there's a large tax in leadership because when all these things go up the chain, then the leadership is working very hard to basically get rid of frictions and to figure out, okay, is that my job, your job, what is it? And, we've all seen this very much in that whenever you have these narrow niches, there's a lot of work basically getting the network to coordinate. So I'm going to talk about this in my career arc. I started out as a very junior engineer working for the Naval Avionics Center as a GS3 engineer. And then I ended up essentially as a manager of an R&D group with almost half of them PhDs or master's level, and managing 3 labs, our power lab, optics lab, and microwave lab. And, basically my job was technical in the sense of trying to figure out what everybody was doing and then working with our various customers and the team to move everything forward. So it was inherently a pie-type job or a tri-type job because I had to keep multiple technologies in my mind at the same time as we were working. So then that facility was bracked, and I went to work for myself as Mandyne for a few years. And I continued to do some of that work. I was working for the Office of Naval Research, coordinating by that time manufacturing technology, packaging technology, and material technology for power electronic packaging. So it was pretty much very similar, but it was, in many ways, it was much deeper technically, but it was not as much programmatic because essentially I was just organizing, kind of passing information backwards and forwards. So part of the work there was working with a company called SATCON. It was not as part of the Office of Naval Research, but as a separate thing. And so they got a program that was a DOE project, partly because of work that I had helped them with. They hired me as the project leader, and essentially I worked as program manager, project engineer, program engineer for the next 6 years. So while I was doing that, though, I was always working on other projects, taking the work that we were doing under AIPM and then rolling it into concepts and doing proposals, some of them for small business innovative research grants, of which I won about 30% of those that I put out, I got in, which is a very high ratio. And so I was working on those 5 projects as well. And then I was talking to companies like GM, companies like Electric Boat, again, a lot of the time tied back to the work that I was doing in AIPM because people were interested, one, in the building block type concept and the modules that we were developing. Basically the packages at the lower level in those, which were very similar to what today we are in things like the Tesla power inverter and whatnot, where it was a kind of integrated package where you could test it and then stick it in the inverter and permanently to get rid of some of the problems you have with yields at the semiconductor level. So, that in that period, it was very effective. And I was working very broadly, the whole thing, technical, programmatic, business development, the whole thing. But that was a small company, and that company had some nice, very lightweight processes and people to support you, and it worked. Then I made the change. I decided I wanted to go to a little bit bigger company, DRS, a defense and organization. And in the early years, when I was working for a business unit that was, again, a kind of an offshoot of a small firm, again, I was doing the whole stack. I was doing technical as well. I started out as a manager, but I ended up doing a lot of business development, a lot of concept development, a lot of proposal development, and that worked pretty well. And then, things started to change as the company reorganized, and thus the issue I had getting hauled on the carpet over OBVP. But so, and then when I went to work for Wolfspeed initially, they had been a small company, APEI. They had been bought by Cree and then spun out as part of Wolfspeed. For the early years, I was focused on a deep technical designing modules. I was kind of doing the whole stack. I was doing, interface manufacturing. I was doing the design. I was doing a little talking to the customer. But then there was a change, and basically the new management came in, and a lot of that changed, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. After about 3 years at Wolfspeed, there was a major reorganization, much towards a much more matrix, stovepiped organization. Part of the thing is that Cree had started as a R&D firm, and they'd made a big breakout in LED, and the power stuff that they had actually been originally working on became a bit of a secondary and was R&D-ish. But then when the EV wave hit, management made the decision that you really need to get into that. When they did that, they brought in a bunch of new management. In the early days, right, when I was working for what was essentially that small firm, they had lightweight processes. They did have processes. They were lightweight. They were easy to work with, and they were very flexible. There were some stovepipes, but they were easy to work. As we moved forward, the problem was that the new organizational people came in. What you got was a lot of people coming in from the outside, from companies who didn't do silicon carbide or power and did silicon automotive, and they saw a company that actually worked pretty well. It looked like the company had processes, and they did, but there was no infrastructure under those processes. Those processes were there because the people were highly expert, done the job for a long time, and they were pi and tri-type people, be it the engineers or operators or whatever, but they did the job, they worked within the system. It looked like you had an infrastructure. When you had new management come in from an organization like TI, which has very deep infrastructure, there was an assumption that infrastructure was there, and it wasn't. I mean, essentially, it was people. And so when they wanted to try and ramp, they said, oh, these people are doing too many jobs, and shoved them out of their pi and tri-type roles and pushed them back into the T-type. And the problem is when you do that, you basically lose all that connective tissue, and essentially, instead of getting improvements, you have a tendency to get decreases in effectiveness and decreases in innovation and speed, and that's what was seen. TI's view had always been you have a PM, and the PM basically sets the task and tells the leads to go do it, right? So we had an organization, and suddenly we had marketing, we had sales, and all these stovepipes existed, but usually they were understaffed, and often the people in them they only knew their role. And sometimes they didn't really understand how those roles interacted with everybody else, or assumed that the way they interacted with everybody was the same as the way they had interacted with whatever was their parent organization had originally been. Because there was no infrastructure, essentially the system broke down. And unless you were able to cross many roles, my problem was I was in a role where I was kind of doing everything. When I saw these changes, I basically said, if I'm going to be effective, I have to be in program management. I shifted there, but then the program office basically was on my back constantly about my interfering with technical things. And why was I doing this? Why was I doing that? Why were you talking to this person? Your program would, basically go sideways for a while until you figured out what was going wrong. Organizationally, they are pushing people back into their lane as a rationale, right? This efficiency, accountability, clear ownership. It's not wrong. The problem is that it assumes that the work is highly defined. It's especially not wrong in a manufacturing facility where you're building the same thing, but for engineering development and or a organization which is constantly bringing out new things needs to move forward, it is not an effective. The engineering piece and the development piece is not that. It's not chunking. It is basically a constant back and forth as old assumptions are proven wrong and you need to readdress them. It's a constant to and fro, and you need pi and tri type people as well as T type people to go through those things and manage them effectively. Otherwise, you slow down to a crawl or have problem after problem after problem because things aren't addressed when they should be. One of the places where we saw this early on was with TDI, that is test, dice, and inspection. For a long time, the tradition is that's an inside job, right? Because it basically is an immediate feedback to the fab as to problems and all the rest of that. But it is a large bulk of work in-house, and it looks very ineffective, right? It looks, because you're doing, particularly with silicon carbide, which has some issues that are not the same as silicon. It means that you have fairly low yields in that. So it was a early decision was in the operations team to move that out of house, right? We can send that to these experts, but there's multiple problems with that. One is it was done without talking to development engineering or product engineering. So it was fait accompli one day, truncated a lot of development work. And then the other one is the problems that we've been having, the new supplier had, because it's silicon carbide, not silicon. Again, that's not a engineering issue. That is a connective tissue issue, because the people who should have said, wait a second, this isn't going to work. Have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Do you know this? Do you know that? Those people were silenced or never in the room, and essentially a decision was made and then carried through, which basically was very destructive to the company for quite a while, because they're not part of the core organization. There's an agent issue here, right? They didn't particularly care about the solution. Pay me enough money, I'll fix it. But for several years, and was now, I have to be honest, right? I'm an iconoclast. I read situations poorly at times. I also tend to be arrogant and unsure both at the same time, which is very confusing to other people. I think it's an outshoot of the dyslexia type, on the spectrum type person that I am. And it confuses people and makes them sometimes not take me as seriously as I think they should, right? But, if you're a pi or a tri-type person within an organization and expects a T-type person, you're going to have friction and you're going to generate it. And it's sometimes on the organization, sometimes it's on your side. You have to accept it and work through it. The cost of not having those type of people is high, right? And it's getting higher. It's, the things not done, the things not communicated, the friction in the system because people are working on slightly the wrong thing all the time. And, the pie and the tri people aren't always welcome because they're seen as stepping out of bounds within structured organizations, but that's kind of the nature of it. You have to know what the cost you're paying to some degree and work through it. And, maybe you can guide the company into the future. So, this is hopefully a fairly simple tool for you to take a look and say, okay, is the company expecting a T and they're getting pies and tries? Are they expecting pies and tries and getting Ts? Do you look at the organization? Do you get awarded for being beyond, your own expertise, or do you get pushed back? Where do you sit? Look at the deployments, look at the failed programs and see if you can see, was the connective tissue not there? Was it missed? What were there questions that nobody asked? Were there issues that weren't addressed? Where was that connective tissue? You can't fix an organization from inside a job description. It has to be an organizational structure. Not everybody and not all organizations can see it clearly. So, seeing it clearly is important. That's where everything sits. And the other key, I think, insight that I have, if your company isn't looking at the pi type, tri type people as they move into the world of AI, if they're still focused on the T type expertise as AI comes along, they're unlikely to make the transition into the new world smoothly. Because essentially what they're going to do is they're going to use AI to get rid of the T-type people and, instead of growing people to be pi and tri-type people, using AI to accelerate that capability and to provide the connectivity between your deep technical and how the system works. That is one of the strengths of AI, as long as it's managed well. This is an area that, can be, I think, a big, an important asset in the future. I'm the unretired engineer. That's my view on all of this. Hopefully I've been of some value. Hit like, hit subscribe. There's some stuff down in the thing of other work that I do, writing science fiction and blogging on certain things. Come back and see what I have to say next week. So cheers.